So I got back from Poland where we were at a LARP called Czasy Pogardy with the Nazir Brigade, and we can now get back to this video series. In the previous video we talked about how Netflix ruined relationship between characters from the Witcher books with their awful writing. In this one I would like to discuss how they unnecessarily butchered the story. I already mentioned last time that they left out very important plot points like Geralt's first meeting with Ciri in Brokilon and many others. They inevitably had to cut out stuff because of 3 stupid decisions. The first one was the inclusion of Yennefer and Ciri from the beginning. They showed Yennefer's backstory right away, expanded on it and did the same with a bit of Ciri's life at court, massacre of Sintra, her escape and following search for Geralt. I remember that at the time Lauren Hissrich was saying that she didn't want to introduce Yennefer and Ciri later in the story like it is in the books, because she wanted the audience to get used to these characters, but I think that she just wanted more female leads in the show from the beginning and this was just her classical PR talk excusing her decision. But even if she was telling the truth, I strongly disagree with her. There was no need to change the story of the first 2 books and cram in Ciri's and Yennefer's storylines. They are introduced perfectly in the source material, and as a hardcore fan of the books, I can say that I love their characters, even though they are not in the story from the beginning. So why change something that clearly works and reinvent the wheel? Both storylines were boring and badly written anyway in the show, so there was no need to include them from the beginning. But because they did that, they didn't have enough time to adapt anything from the books properly. They've butchered every short story they've tried to adapt, and even the other 2 storylines were poorly developed. Another stupid decision was adapting 2 books in just 1 season. They had to rush through the story and leave out so much good stuff. And I don't understand why when Hissrich was bragging at one point that Netflix ordered 7 seasons right from the get-go, and she has them mapped out apparently. I never understood why filmmakers are rushing through the stories they are adapting, especially with TV shows. If they would take their time, it would be so much better, and there would be more content that would make people stay subscribed longer. Also, if they would do The Last Wish as the first season, the last short story is the introduction of Yennefer and the start of her relationship with Geralt. So if you would end the first season with that, it would give Yennefer's character real significance, because she would be the big finale. And same with Ciri, because they could adapt the whole Sword of Destiny as a second season, and it would end with Ciri and Geralt reuniting. Everything would have more time to breathe, and they wouldn't have to constantly jump between storylines and confuse people with the time jumps. The third stupid decision that Netflix made was cramming in their made-up bullshit. When fans of the books were complaining that they've butchered the short stories in the first season, Hissrich was trying to assure everyone that it will be different with the second season. She straight up said that there's just so much material in the books that she doesn't feel the need to start inventing her own. And we all know how that turned out with the second season. It was even worse than the first one. They again completely butchered Blood of Elves and left out so much good stuff because they added these stupid plot lines of Yennefer, Fringilla, Francesca, Wolf Mayer and Ciri with obelisks. Every one of these was so dumb and unnecessary, and it's the reason why they left out much better parts from the books. By the way, I often see people say that the first season and the first episode of the second season were pretty good, and only after that it went downhill. And I always think to myself, what are you talking about? Those are the episodes that were composed of Yennefer's and Ciri's storylines, which were awful, and the rest of it was based on the first 2 books of short stories, and they completely butchered every last one of them. Events from every short story happen differently in the show, and it's always so much worse than in the books. In some of them they leave out such important plot points that the story doesn't make sense anymore, like with The Lesser Evil, where they completely left out Caldemeyn explaining Tridam Ultimatum, which is the piece of information thanks to which Geralt finds out that Renfri betrayed him, and she wants to murder everyone in the market if Stregobor doesn't leave his tower. And you can solve this just with one scene. Or with others they adapt so little from them that the majority of the short story is left out, like with the Edge of the World short story, which is a great introduction to the elves and their struggles. There's this long dialogue Geralt has with Filavandrel, which explains the overall stance elves have on their persecution, and it's a great example of the moral ambiguity you can often see in the books, where no side is exactly in the right because they all act like assholes, and they also have a point about the other side. Netflix spent exactly 5 minutes on this whole scene, which is 13 pages long in the books, and they changed the dialogue completely, so there's nothing left from Sapkowski's genius writing, and it's just this uninteresting below-average drivel, which is nowhere near as engaging as the original. This story is essentially a precursor to the creation of Scoia'tael, because it establishes elves and their position in this world, so you then understand the mentality behind the elven guerrilla group, and they fucked it up because we needed to see sorceresses getting turned into eels, which is yet another stupid bullshit made up by the writers, by the way. But let's talk about A Grain of Truth, which is the short story Netflix adapted in the first episode of the second season, and that so many people praise. In the original, Nivellen is redeemed at the end, but in the show they purposely changed it, so Geralt and Ciri could condemn him as a rapist at the end, which is pretty rich since Yennefer did something way worse in the first season, when she forced a whole town into having an orgy, and that was made up by the writers. There's nothing like that in the books. But I guess that when a woman does it, it's okay. Anyway, in the books Nivellen admits to Geralt right away that he raped the priestess, and there's more context to it, because he was very young and the soldiers who he was supposed to command manipulated him in a similar way as the soldiers in Game of Thrones manipulated Theon into attacking Winterfell and killing small children. Nivellen was probably even younger than Theon, and he clearly regrets it as he gets older and wiser. It's not like what he did was okay, but it wasn't completely his doing. He regrets it and pays for it with years of suffering. And he definitely doesn't keep it as a secret from Geralt. But it's the same thing like what they did to Ike of Denethor. The progressive Netflix writers saw a guy who raped someone, which is probably like a red rag to a bull for them, so they couldn't help themselves and had to make Nivellen look as bad as possible. So as you can see, this episode and the first season were not good. They were as shit as the rest of the second season. But people have such low standards when it comes to adaptations. It's enough for them when there are few recognizable scenes from the books and they happen in somewhat similar order, and they don't care that all surrounding context was changed and it's always done worse than how it happened in the books, and even the dialogues are much worse. The same can be said about the third season. Last thing I want to mention in regards to the story is that they showed things too early, or included things that were unnecessary in the first season, and they didn't have to show them at all at this point. What I mean by showing things too early is, for example, Yennefer's childhood, which I already mentioned in previous videos and explained why that's done so much better in the books, because it serves as an important reveal which challenges your view of Yennefer's character. Similar to that is also the Massacre of Cintra, which is also used as a pretty interesting reveal. Throughout the saga, you only see it as these nightmares which Ciri has, and then Cahir tells Geralt what really happened, and this part is in the Tower of the Swallow, which is almost the end of the saga. You found out how Ciri survived the massacre and got out of the city, and that it was actually Cahir who saved her, which Netflix of course changed as everything they adapted from the books. So as you can see, they showed it too early, and now it can't be used as a reveal anymore. But what I also wanted to talk about is that they didn't have to show these battles at all in the first season. They showed the one for Cintra in the first episode, or the one for Sodden Hill at the end of the first season, but these are both battles that we never see in the books. People only mention that they already happened. And this is something that was often done in the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, where they didn't have big enough budget yet, so they either only show start of a battle, where Tyrion is immediately knocked out and wakes up only after the battle is over, or they show start of the battle with Robb, then it cuts to black, and then in the next scene the battle is over as well. So this is a great way to save money from the budget, which you can then invest elsewhere. And the funny thing is that you can see how desperately Netflix was trying to copy the epic battles from Game of Thrones, because they wanted to have their own epic dark fantasy show like that. But the thing they missed is that Game of Thrones started doing these battles only in later seasons, when the show was already a huge success and they had big enough budget for it. It reminds me so much of how DC was trying to catch up to Marvel with their big ensemble movies like Avengers, but Marvel took their time to slowly build up these heroes one by one with several movies, and DC thought that they could do the first team up of the main trio from Justice League in their second movie. And that's one of the many reasons why Snyderverse always sucked and inevitably failed. You know, if I had a nickel for every time Henry Cavill was part of a project that was rushed like this, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. But back to The Witcher. My point with this is that they didn't have to show any of these battles because they aren't shown in the books either. The way they did them sucked anyway, and the only thing it achieved is that it cost them money. If they would just follow the story as it is in the books and didn't include Ciri's and Yennefer's backstories in the first season, as I mentioned before, they would save money which they could invest in other parts of the production, and they could show these battles as flashbacks in later seasons, when they would have a bigger budget for it, and it would serve as a reveal of what actually happened back then. And by the way, I don't mind when adaptations leave things out or make changes and do things differently, but there has to be a good reason for it. This is a topic for a whole separate video, but if you want to change something and do it differently than the source material, it should be either as good or even better. If it's worse, then there's no reason for the change. This is something that The Last of Us TV show did well, in my opinion.
My philosophy on this show has always been, when should we deviate and when should we come back? If it's kind of the same or worse, we stay where the game is. If it's better, we deviate.
A lot of people who used to defend the Witcher Netflix show often said that you of course have to make changes when you are adapting a story into a different medium, but most changes which Netflix is doing didn't have to be made at all, and they serve no purpose other than that this is how the writers wanted things to go, so I don't accept this as an argument in this case. And similar to that is the argument that fans of the books just want the show to be one-to-one, word-for-word translation of the books, and that's such a straw man. Nobody says that. You can definitely make changes if the different medium requires it. I would even accept changes that someone makes just because they want to, but they have to give me a good reason for it. Or to put it differently, the result should be really fucking good and definitely not worse than the source material. There are examples of adaptations that changed a lot of things from the source material, but are still very good and respectful towards it, like the Harry Potter movies or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. To this, people often say that they remember exactly the same discussions, and fans also complaining about changes after the release. I find it hard to believe that they were exactly the same. I could accept that some book purists were complaining about Peter Jackson movies not including Tom Bombadil, or swapping Glorfindel for Arwen, and so on. And yes, I agree that those are pretty futile complaints, but they are definitely not exactly the same. I was a huge fan of Harry Potter books way before the movies started coming out, and yeah, I remember being a bit disappointed when Goblet of Fire started leaving things out and changing the story more significantly, but I liked the movies anyway in the end. These changes were not so bad that it would ruin my experience completely, like it is with the Netflix show. And there are even videos that raise great points, for example how they changed Ron's character to be just a stupid comic relief, similar to Jaskier, oftentimes because they wanted to make Hermione look better and more competent. So even though these movies are pretty great and fans of the books love them, they are still being criticized for the changes they deserve to be criticized for. When I said that the changes that Netflix made were awful in the past, people who used to defend the show often acted like I'm saying that all changes are bad and filmmakers just can't change things, period. No, there are levels to this, and I'm talking about changes that watered the original story down and changed it so much for the worse that it's outright disrespectful towards the books. But anyway, I also wanted to mention dialogues. That's one of Sapkowski's biggest strengths, and it's on par with the best dialogues in Game of Thrones. So how did they adapt this aspect of the books? Exactly the same way as the story, which means that they are almost always cut short and changed for the worse. I remember that people who used to defend this show often said to this that Netflix of course has to speed up some things, because they are targeting a wider audience, which wants more action instead of boring dialogues. And that's such a bullshit argument. Did you forget that Game of Thrones has become the most popular fantasy show exactly for this reason? People love well-written dialogues. If you search for dialogues from Game of Thrones on YouTube, most of them have millions of views, so don't tell me that a wider audience can't comprehend well-written dialogues and they would be bored by them when they are clearly watching them even decade after the release of Game of Thrones. Baginski, who is executive producer for the Witcher Netflix show, recently said something similar and people lost their minds over it. I agree that Baginski is an idiot and a sellout for saying this, but what's funny to me is that just a few years ago most people were using exactly this argument to defend the show themselves. But I need to make a separate video about the hypocrisy of the Witcher fandom sometimes. Let's get back to the dialogues. The rest of them, which are made up by the writers, are really bad. It sounds like something modern Californians would say, so it's pretty out of place in the medieval fantasy setting of the Witcher world. That also brings me to the constant swearing, which I hate so much. It's so overused that there are video compilations of all the swear words used in the show.
Fucking lucky. Fuck is the point? Fuck! What the fuck? Fucking
To me this sounds like it was written by some wine aunt who thinks that saying fuck is edgy and that medieval fantasy setting means that people will be dirty and say fuck all the time. And it's not like the Witcher books don't use swear words, but they use them naturally and only at times when it's fitting. Sometimes even as a joke, like with Zoltan's parrot Feldmarszalek Duda, who says kurwa mać all the time, or when Sapkowski is making fun of hippies in a distinctively Polish sarcastic way. So as you can see, Netflix completely butchered the story and dialogues from the books in every season. If I forgot something or you have something to add, let me know in the comments. I love reading them. In the next video I would like to talk about how Netflix ruined the atmosphere and world building, which isn't the most important aspect of The Witcher from the objective point of view, but for me it's very important. And it was the first sign that this will be a bad adaptation, because Netflix doesn't understand the spirit of The Witcher. So if that's something that would interest you and you are new here, subscribe so you won't miss it.